History is often written by the victors. It lives in textbooks, museums, and official records. But for Black people, so much of our story was never allowed into those spaces. Our memories were scattered by slavery, distorted by colonialism, and silenced by force. Yet, the story survived. It survived in rhythm. It survived in drumbeats, chants, and songs passed from one generation to the next. Reggae music didn't just emerge as a sound, it emerged as a voice. A voice for the unheard, the displaced, the marginalized. Born on the streets of Jamaica, reggae became a global messenger, carrying Black history, struggle, faith, and resistance across oceans and borders. Where history tried to erase, reggae remembered. This is the story of how reggae became more than music, and transformed into a vessel for telling Black history. Reggae was never created simply to entertain. From its very first heartbeat, it functioned as testimony. Born in Jamaica during the late 1960s, reggae emerged from the lived experiences of Black people whose histories had been fragmented by slavery and systemic erasure. In a world where Black voices were often shut out of official archives, reggae became an alternative record, an audible history book, passed from speaker to speaker, generation to generation. Reggae did what formal institutions often refuse to do. It told the truth. Long before reggae existed, Black history was preserved through oral tradition, through drumming, chants, proverbs, and songs. Enslaved Africans carried these traditions across the Atlantic, even as slave masters tried to suppress them. In Jamaica, these cultural survivals evolved into forms like kumina, revival, and nyabingi drumming, each one maintaining an African spiritual and historical consciousness. Reggae was the modern continuation of this tradition. It inherited the role of the griot, the storyteller, the historian, the witness. Where books were inaccessible and education was controlled, reggae spoke directly to the people in a language they understood, grounded in rhythm, memory, and lived experience. One of reggae's most radical acts was its refusal to sanitize history. The music called out the forces responsible for Black suffering. Babylon became the symbolic term for colonial power, police brutality, economic exploitation, and mental oppression. Through reggae, listeners learned that their daily struggles weren't personal failures, but the continuation of a long history of injustice. Songs openly referenced slavery, forced labor, land theft, and racial hierarchy. These weren't abstract topics. They were realities that shaped housing conditions, education, employment, and incarceration. Reggae connected the past to the present, showing that colonialism didn't just end with independence. It merely changed its form. When Bob Marley sang of pirates stealing Africans from their homeland, he collapsed centuries into a single verse, reminding the world that the trauma of enslavement still echoed in modern Black life. Reggae made history impossible to ignore. Central to reggae's historical mission was the restoration of African identity. Through Rastafari philosophy, reggae rejected the colonial narrative that Africa was somehow backward or irrelevant. Instead, Africa was presented as the spiritual and cultural source of Black people worldwide. Reggae lyrics spoke of Ethiopia, Zion, repatriation, and Black kingship, not as fantasy, but as reclamation. Figures like Haile Selassie and Marcus Garvey were elevated as symbols of pride and self-determination. When the band Burning Spear repeatedly invoked Garvey's name, it wasn't accidental. It was a correction to history books that had erased Black leadership and global influence. Through reggae, Black listeners were reminded that their history did not begin in chains. It began in great civilizations. Reggae also documented life in the urban ghettos of Jamaica, spaces created by colonial planning, economic neglect, and political manipulation. But these communities weren't depicted as hopeless. They were shown as sites of resilience, creativity, and truth. Artists sang about hunger, violence, police harassment, political corruption, and broken promises. In doing so, reggae functioned as grassroots journalism. When mainstream media ignored the suffering of poor Black communities, reggae preserved their stories in sound. The music captured not just events but emotions, the frustration, the faith, the anger, and the endurance of everyday people. These songs became historical records of how Black communities survived under immense pressure. As reggae traveled beyond Jamaica, it became a unifying language for the global Black experience. In Africa, it resonated with post-colonial nations grappling with identity and governance. In the United Kingdom, it spoke to Caribbean immigrants facing racism and marginalization. In the United States, it aligned with civil rights and Black Power movements. In South Africa, reggae was embraced as a voice against apartheid. At Zimbabwe's independence celebration, Bob Marley's performance symbolized reggae's powerful role in liberation struggles. The music proved that Black history wasn't isolated by borders, it was interconnected, shared, and ongoing. Reggae gave oppressed people a soundtrack for resistance. It didn't always call for violence. More often, it demanded consciousness. Knowledge of self became an act of rebellion. But despite its heavy themes, reggae was never only about suffering. It also documented Black joy, love, spirituality, and hope. These elements were essential to survival. Reggae taught that remembering history wasn't meant to trap people in pain, but to empower them to endure and transform. Songs about love weren't escapes from reality, they were affirmations of humanity in a world that often denied Black people their full personhood. Spiritual reggae offered faith not as passive acceptance, but as inner strength and moral clarity. In this way, reggae told a complete story, not just how Black people suffered, but how they survived. Today, reggae remains a living archive. Contemporary artists continue to draw from its tradition to address racism, police violence, economic inequality, and cultural identity. Even as musical styles evolve, reggae's historical function endures. Every bass line carries memory. Every lyric adds a footnote to an unfinished story. Reggae proves that history doesn't only live in libraries and museums. It lives in sound systems, on street corners, and in family gatherings. It lives in songs passed down, sung aloud, and felt deeply. Reggae is more than music. It is Black history speaking for itself. Reggae reminds us that history isn't just found in archives, it lives in people. It lives in memory, in struggle, and in survival. Every lyric, every rhythm, every echo of bass carries stories that refuse to die. Through reggae, Black people reclaimed their past, confronted their present, and imagined their future. It taught generations to question power, honor their ancestors, and recognize their worth in a world that often denied it. Reggae did not wait for permission to tell the truth, it told it anyway. And as long as the music continues to play, the story remains unfinished. Because reggae is not just a reflection of history. It is history still speaking. If this story resonated with you, help keep the message alive. Share this video with someone who loves reggae, history, or culture. And leave a comment below. Tell us which reggae song first taught you something about Black history, identity, or resistance. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth behind the music and the people who shaped our world. Thanks for listening. When we share and remember, we ensure these stories are never silenced again.